Hi guys. Sorry this has been so long in coming. There was a problem with the camera. If you have no idea who I am, check out the God Delusion Analysis 1, because this is part 2, and it won't make as much sense if you don't watch the first one. Actually, I'm doing this a bit differently anyway, because chapter 3 of the God Delusion is structured a bit differently. Professor Dawkins gave 10 logical reasons for believing in God and attempted to refute them. So what I'm going to do is go down the list, summarize both the arguments and Professor Dawkins' response to them, and then offer my own response. First, I should probably say that I'm going to be using the British words and pronunciations in this video, because I'm talking about a book that a British man wrote. Alright, here we go. Reason 1. The necessity of an uncaused cause. Just to elaborate, the reasoning goes that everything needs a cause. And since it's silly to go back and back forever and ever, there has to be an end point, and that's God. Professor Dawkins raised the question, why wouldn't God himself require a cause? My answer is that the whole thing about causes is a law governing physical things. We know that physical things don't last forever, and they don't spontaneously come from nowhere. But God isn't physical, so he wouldn't have to be bound by that law. Professor Dawkins went on to ask, why would God have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, good, and creative? My answer is that he'd have all power over the earth because he made it. He'd know everything about the world and us because he made it and us. He would be good because God would be the very standard of goodness, by right of creation and by right of being the highest being. He'd be creative because he created the world. Professor Dawkins then asked, even if God were real, why would he forgive sins and listen to prayers the way that theists claim? And here he's right. Even if you logically demonstrate that God exists, that doesn't somehow automatically prove that he interacts with us. But then, I don't think anybody does try to say that God must be someone who interacts with us just because he's real. Okay, reason 2. There are degrees of goodness, and in order for there to be degrees of goodness, there has to be an ultimate good, and that's God. Professor Dawkins said, that doesn't make sense. Does the fact that there are degrees of smelliness mean that there has to be an ultimate smelly thing? Once again, I'd have to say, he's right. Degrees of goodness has nothing to do with anything. However, the existence of goodness does make a case for God, because atheists have to answer the question of where we do get our moral standards from if there is no absolute moral standard. Alright, reason 3, argument from design. The world looks like it's been designed by someone intelligent, so it must have been. That's God. Professor Dawkins said, Darwin gave a perfectly good explanation for how the world could have evolved through a natural process. Therefore, God is not logically necessary. Frankly, that's a bit too general to comment on properly, but I was under the impression that Darwin only postulated on how the evolutionary process could have produced more advanced organisms, not on how it actually began. By the way, Professor Dawkins did go into more detail in a later chapter, and so will I. Now I have to warn you, reason number 4 is weird, so if it doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. But here goes, reason number 4. It's possible to think of something, or someone, so great that you can't think of anything greater, and that idea in your head would be God. But a being who doesn't exist isn't as great as a being who does. So in order to really be thinking of someone so great that you can't think of anyone greater, you'd have to be thinking of someone that exists. Therefore, God is real. Professor Dawkins said, with his trademark good manners, that that's unbelievably idiotic, and as a matter of fact, he's right. The argument rests on the bizarre assumption that being real is superior to not being real. I mean, if you think about it, they're so far apart they can't be compared. However, totally apart from this ridiculous philosophical claptrap, the idea that anyone has any idea of God at all is worth noting. It's not proof for God, but how do you explain it? Richard Dawkins and other atheists have offered various explanations for how belief in God has continued, such as by indoctrination, manipulation, brainwashing, etc. But how did the belief begin? Reason 5. There are beautiful things, so there must be a God. Professor Dawkins was like, don't be dumb, that's totally irrelevant. And you know, he's right. That's basically proving the existence of God by assuming it. Reason number 6. Personal experience. People say, I know God is real because I've seen him or heard him or interacted with him in such and such a way. Professor Dawkins dismissed it by saying that there's a logical explanation for these religious experiences. I say it's impossible to prove or know one way or the other who's right on an issue based on personal experience. Most people take their own personal experiences quite seriously, but others often don't. The other person will almost always find some other explanation more plausible. Personally, I wouldn't automatically dismiss any and all experiences out of hand, but neither would I try to build a logical case on something that's subjective, particularly if I was trying to sound convincing to someone else. Right, reason 7, the Bible, or as people might say now, there is a book. Professor Dawkins said, just because a book says something doesn't mean it's true. The Bible is filled with glaring inconsistencies. And he went on to list some things that he saw as inconsistencies, such as Luke saying that there was a census in such and such a year, and there's no record of any such thing anywhere else, and so on and so forth. I would agree that a book isn't true just because it's there and it says something. But nobody does believe the Bible just because it's there. Many people more knowledgeable than I am have written many books and articles about the reliability of the Bible, so I won't go into detail here. But consider this. Do you honestly think a book that had glaring inconsistencies would last long enough to be around now? For example, do you honestly believe that Luke could write that there was a census in such and such a year when no such thing happened, and nobody living then would notice it? That would be like a book published now, saying as absolute fact that Tom Smith was King of England in 2012. It would just be so obviously false that nobody would believe it, so it could never spread. Alright, reason 8. Many scientists of the past were Christians, and Charles Darwin himself converted before he died. Professor Dawkins contended that while a few scientists of the past were Christians, there weren't that many of them, and Darwin did not convert on his deathbed. As far as Darwin, he's right. Charles Darwin did not change his mind on his deathbed. Were most scientists Christians? Honestly, I don't know. I know a lot of them talked about God, but I couldn't guarantee that that wasn't just because it was fashionable. I know it's only somewhat recently that the majority of society has, somewhat randomly, assumed that it's unscientific to believe in God. So scientists of the past wouldn't have had a problem with theism, but I don't know what their actual beliefs were. All anyone can do now is wrangle about the precise meaning of their quotes. But the whole thing is irrelevant anyway. Just because a scientist does or doesn't believe something doesn't make it true. That would be like saying America must really be India because, after all, that's what Christopher Columbus believed and he was a really clever explorer. Reason 9. Pascal's wager. Just to explain for those who aren't familiar with it, and I wasn't until I read about it in the God Delusion, a French philosopher named Pascal argued for the existence of God by saying that atheists have more to lose by being wrong than theists do. After all, if there's no life beyond the grave, what harm does it do to believe in God? But if you live your life denying God and turn out to be wrong, you're in big trouble. Professor Dawkins asked, what about the risks of believing in the wrong God? And how can I make myself believe? And why should belief be the one thing that's so important to God anyway? And you know, he's right. In fact, he sounded like me there, answering everything with a question. It's true that Pascal's wager doesn't take into account what would happen if someone believed in a false God. And it's also true that it's impossible to make oneself believe anything. But as to why belief should be so important to God, if it's important to him, assuming his existence for the sake of the argument, it is. If it isn't important to him, it isn't. It isn't inherent in the general concept of a God that he would be concerned with whether or not people believe in him, but it's worth being open to the possibility. Reason 10. Bayesian arguments. Again, just to explain, a man named Stephen Unman took 6 facts, listed whether he thought they made it more or less likely that God existed, and by what percentage, plugged them into something called a Bayes mathematical theorem, and came up with a 67% likelihood of God existing. Professor Dawkins said, "That's just based on someone's opinion, it's a waste of time." And he's right, it's a complete waste of time and space. Okay, that takes me to the end of the chapter. Again, I'd love to know what you think. Thank you for watching.